Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. My guest this morning is Gord Magill. And if you don't know Gord, you should and you will, because this is a trucker who's also a citizen journalist. I know he doesn't necessarily identify as a journalist because that's a bad word these days, but he's doing his job like a lot of us are trying to do uh, on the internet, on social media. So when we come back, this is a bombshell. And I know a lot of people on social media say everything's a bombshell these days. Every time somebody yawns, it's a bombshell. But this really is. This is how the American Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security conspired. Conspired, because conspired just means more than one person to undermine the Freedom Convoy. We'll be back in a minute. So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist. Thank you again for watching. And yes, please like the station. The more you like the station, the less YouTube suppression we get. We get that every day. And we're here to fight Justin Trudeau's censorship, which is all about the story today, actually. It's about so-called disinformation and how the U.S. Disinformation Governance Board, you remember that, because that wacko Nina Jankowicz was ahead of it. And this is the woman who went on TikTok and did a little song and dance act about disinformation. And of course, we were all horrified. Our freedom was in the hands of this woman. But the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which was, of course, the overall agency for this Disinformation Governance Board, was working with the Canadian government to undermine and try to deplatform the Freedom Convoy. I find this absolutely fascinating. So, this is the article that set all of this off. Can you lead us through? This is Ammo Land, of course. Some viewers might not know it, but if you have any interest in firearms, this is the Bible. So, how did this all start, Gord?
So another Twitter user by the name of CBC Watcher, who's a great follow and tracks many of the issues we do, had posted this article in AmmoLand, and if you dig through it, it makes some pretty major allegations about what the DHS is up to. And AmmoLand is, it's a blog about gun rights in the United States, and the writer for AmmoLand is a supporter of an organization called Gun Owners of America, GOA. GOA are always muckraking through government documents to see what's coming down the pipe as far as gun control goes, because that's always an ongoing battle. And in one of their Freedom of Information Act requests, they retrieved these documents regards the Department of Homeland Security and this Disinformation Governance Board. And if you scroll through the documents, it shows that there was meetings between DHS employees where they were talking about leveraging Meta, who is Facebook, and Twitter to censor anybody discussing the Freedom Convoy, and specifically using the allegations that disinformation about the Freedom Convoy was coming from America's adversaries, which is to say they were playing along with this completely false accusation that was first propagated on the CBC, no less, that the Freedom Convoy was financed and backed by Russian money, of which no evidence has ever been shown. And there's none here in these DHS documents. They just make allegations about it and then decide that based on these allegations, they should go to Twitter and to Facebook and try and throttle Canadians' freedom of speech.
Yeah, I put up the document. This is some bureaucrat here just blithely talking about how they're going to see if they can deplatform people, how and what's possible. And I find this absolutely fact, because it's typical bureaucraties. We discussed whether engaging with Meta and Twitter to share information convoy related matters. So this goes back, of course, to the revelation that the social media platforms were working with the government to actively spy on people and to censor And this I think is at the root of this story. And they were trying to deplatform the Freedom Convoy principles. And just before I forget, were you involved in the Freedom Convoy
I
protest
I went
in
home to
Ottawa?
Ottawa. So, full disclosure, I live in the United States now.
Yeah.
And as a matter of solidarity, I traveled to Ottawa when the Freedom Convoy came to town, welcomed the Western Convoy on an overpass on 417 west of the city, and then spent the rest of the weekend there. So I'm merely a supporter. And then when I came home, I leveraged some media contacts, and some other people asked me to start writing about it, including Newsweek. So I did. So I've been writing about it ever since. But I am not technically involved with the organizers of the Freedom Convoy at all.
Okay. But this was sort of an accident, though. Because this freedom of information request was made, and Freedom Convoy just sort of stuck out in that request. And as a result of that, you got this information. So was it sort of a surprise that you stumbled onto this?
Right. Yeah. Like I say, another Twitter user found the link from these MLN guys, and I just started digging into it, and I was like, holy cow. And I even think that the Gun Owners of America, the people who filed the original FOIA request, I don't think they were looking for anything to do with Freedom Convoy. Like that's not their area of concern. So it seems like this might be a little bit of effort on the part of Gun Owners of America and a little bit of chance. And what an interesting expose we've stumbled on.
Well, there's no question about that. And I find it fascinating as well is that this readout from February the 11th. Now, we all know Valentine's Day 2022, February 14th, 2022, Justin Trudeau invokes the Emergencies Act. This is a readout from a conversation between Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau. And it talks about the prime minister promised quick action in enforcing the law. And he's talking here about the standoff at Coots and in Ontario in terms of the border action. And the prime minister thanked him for the steps he and other Canadian authorities, the president thanked him for the steps he and other Canadian authorities are taking to restore the open passage of bridges to the United States. In turn, the prime minister thanked the president and his administration, the governor of Michigan, the U.S. officials, for all the assistance that the United States is providing to resolve this disruption. And this is just days before the was stifled. Freedom Convoy was stifled by the Emergencies Act, and of course, this looks highly suspicious.
Right.
I
Well, the assistance part here is very interesting, David. Pardon my interruption, but that
okay,
last line about the assistance, um,
yeah.
the American government, I don't know what sort of assistance like they think that's that important. So what's going on here is that what they're alluding to, I think, is this very DHS memo, and that the Canadian government couldn't get any other help out of the American government, right? So they were trying to get tow trucks to come to Ottawa. They were calling companies in New York State and Vermont. They were calling companies in Montana. There was an ATIP document release here a few weeks ago that was exposed by another Twitter user, Buck McYoung, that showed that the Canadian government being unable to get any tow truck companies to cooperate with them to remove trucks from Coots or Ottawa, were trying to get equipment from the United States, and American tow truck companies basically told them to pound sand, or our drivers aren't vaccinated, or like blew them off, right? And there wasn't really anything that like the American police could do on their side, because all the protests were on the Canadian side of the border. So what was this assistance? Well, it sure seems like the assistance that they were rendering was trying to compel Twitter and Facebook to block people's posting of their opinions. Now, did that take place? No, I think most people still were able to talk about this stuff online, but it shows that like they even considered it is pretty revealing.
Well, yeah, it certainly is it certainly is revealing, but we don't really know because 80% of the documents related to the Freedom Convoy are still under wraps, are still not subject to public perusals. So we
That's
really
right.
don't know the extent to which this went on. And I think it's I think it's absolutely outrageous that we almost accept this in Canada now, that the government can play with us this way. Now, you've looked at all of the, I think there's 160 pages that you were looking at last night. Does anything else stand out in your mind in terms of what's going on here?
Well, bureaucrats do bureaucrating, I guess. I mean, there's some fairly repetitive stuff in there, but like I say, it sort of appears like they were running around with their hair on fire because they truly believed that the Russians or somebody were behind all this supposed disinformation about the Freedom Convoy, and they never did come up with any evidence of that. So I mean, through all the parts where they're talking about the Freedom Convoy in all those 160 pages, it's only over the course of a couple of them. But like I say, they didn't come up with any evidence of it, and it belies the fact that they were sort of, huffing their own jenkum in the belief that, regular people in Canada wouldn't, do this on their own. It must be foreigners. Nobody in Canada would ever disagree with us.
Well, that's, I said that from the very beginning in terms of nobody expected Canadians to rise up against COVID mandates. And I look back on it now, and I think I realized at the time I was a part of history. But I think more than that, I don't know if we would have seen the rollback of these mandates and sanity in terms of how effective this vaccine was and whether or not people should be giving it to newborns, unless these people had not have risen up and said, enough of this. We have, at least we have freedom of speech in this country.
For now.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, this is something else I wanted to talk to you about is, so as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I've been writing about this situation out in Coutts with these 4 men who were arrested over the course of February 13th and 14th of 2022. A verdict just came down in their trial, which finally got going on June 6th, like almost 2.5 years later. And an idea I've sort of come up with here, I think, is that the verdict and the pursuit of this case against Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert, I believe, in part, is a trial balloon for whatever's to come down the pipe with Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, which, as I'm sure you know, has, the first part of it is pretty good. Oh, we're going to deal with pedophiles and child pornographers and these bad actors on the internet. Okay, great. That's awesome. Why can't that part of it be standalone legislation? Oh no, they have to come in and say, we're going to throw you in jail forever if you are suspected of advocating genocide. We are going to prosecute you for future crimes based on your thought. Like, this is some Minority Report level stuff that's buried in this Bill C-63. And I think what you see here, if you followed the trial, you see that they had no evidence of the conspiracy to murder police officers, which were these, very damning allegations laid against these 4 guys. The charges against the other 2, Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak, were dropped back in February, and then the jury found these guys not guilty, right? So how is it that they were found not guilty of all these crazy allegations? Well, it turns out that the Crown had no evidence of it, but what they did do for days and weeks of this trial was go through allegations from undercover officers that had no wires, no recordings, no video, nothing. It was just pure allegations from undercovers. And then they also went through texts and group chats and phone messages between Tony Oleanick and various other people, and to a lesser extent, Chris Carbert. What they were trying to do is convict Tony Oleanick of possessing the incorrect opinions. They tried to parse out the meaning of emojis, like in a courtroom, right? And they were trying to make it that Tony was like some kind of bad guy because he had opinions about the Chinese Communist Party and that they might be working with the Canadian government. Oh, where have we heard that before, right? Or the United Nations. They were literally trying to prosecute Tony Oleanick and make him guilty of, like, quote unquote, being a conspiracy theorist. They had no actual hard evidence. And the tie-in with C-63 here is, if they had convicted Tony Oleanick, they basically would have set a precedent, right? Like, and when and if C-63 passes, Now they have a conviction involving people's thoughts, what they say in text messages, what they say on social media. And that's what they're gunning for here. And I'm glad that the jury saw through this crap.
Well, I think that's the first time I've heard that hypothesis here, because I have been fighting very strongly. If anybody who follows this broadcast or my Substack, and yeah, we'll get to your Substack in a minute, I know that this is probably the most important issue facing Canadians right now in terms of personal freedom. If this bill passes, we are going to lose our freedom of speech. We are going to lose our basic fundamental democratic freedom in this country, because we can't have a democracy without freedom of speech. And the very idea that this has a thought crimes component, I couldn't believe that when I first discovered it, because you really have to read through this bill very, very carefully. Because as you say, yeah, it's camouflaged. And if you watched the news conference where the Justice Minister introduced this bill, he didn't talk about censorship. He didn't talk about misinformation or disinformation. That was out of flavor at the time because everybody saw through that. He talked about protecting children from child pornography and protecting women from revenge porn. And it was all about protection, protection, protection. And of course, this is all a smokescreen. And all you have to do is read the fine print, or just read the bill, and you discover that I could be subject to house arrest because somebody down the street says, hey, I think Krayden might be thinking a bad thought. And of course, we're seeing this already happening around the world, where police are at the doors of people because they posted something. They they had a YouTube comment, or they said something on X that went against the government policy, the official narrative at the time, and the police are at the door. And it just astounds me that we can even look at this and say, "Oh my God, we have entered into 1984."
Right. And you
So,
see this with the Coots trial too, right? So like in court, in the testimony, it is revealed by one of these undercover officers that they did not begin considering Tony Oleanek a suspect or somebody worthy of casing until an incident that took place in Smuggler's Saloon, which is this little bar in the town of Coots that had become a sort of de facto meeting place for all of the people involved in the protest. And a woman was sitting in Smuggler's Saloon and was overheard by an undercover officer saying, I haven't been feeling really well. And, one of the leaders of this protest, this guy named Tony Oleanek, he's going to bring me some ivermectin because, I want something to treat what I believe might be COVID. And that perked their ears up, right? And another thing that was revealed in court when Chris Carbert was examined by his own lawyer, that he rejected. Chris Carbert owned his own landscaping business, right? And he had a bunch of different employees. And he was offered this, what were they called in Canada? These loans to help businesses keep paying their employees and keep their businesses afloat during the lockdowns. I can't remember the name. Yeah. I can't remember the name of the program, but he rejected it. He said, "No, I'm not taking this government money." Right. So yeah. you have these two primary suspects who had already been guilty of telling the government to go pound sand and making their own decisions and rejecting, basically state assistance. Right. And so and another component of the Coots thing that ties into the freedom of speech is that if the government can arrest 4 men or anybody at any protest, then, concoct a fantasy about you supposedly conspiring to murder police officers, they'll just charge you with all this heinous stuff and then put you in jail for 2 years, deny you bail. You got to remember, the Coots guys had no criminal records, no history of violence, no nothing. I think maybe Chris Carbert had a drug possession charge from when he was a kid. But basically, no criminal records, perfectly upstanding, good citizens, worked real hard, loved by their families and communities, no bail, thrown away in remand for 2 years of your life with no chance to defend yourself, full-on scapegoating and media smearing campaign against you that you're never going to get the stink off you for the rest of your life. And now they've just been proven not guilty. So if the government can do this to people, what right to protest do you actually have? What right to freedom of speech do you actually have if this threat of the government being able to do this to you and then get away with it? Where's your rights?
So Really, this was a thought that you think the prosecution, the Crown, was trying to prove a thought crime basically here because
I mean,
these.
that's the unspoken underlying part of this, right? And speaking of the Crown prosecutor, Mr. Stephen Johnston, those who've been following the Coots trial will know that last year there was an incident involving this envelope. Tony Oleanek's previous counsel, a woman from Calgary by the name of Tony Rolston, had witnessed evidence indicating that Stephen Johnston and his right-hand man, I think the guy's name is Matt Dialowitz or something, that they had been in Coots, right? So there's over and above this incident with Rolston, if you look through the ATIP documents, it shows that the Crown was in Coots advising the RCMP. Now, there's a gray area here between advising and directing, right? So if the Crown is directing the RCMP, the Crown can then not be part of that prosecution because that's a conflict of interest, right? So Rolston sees this documentation indicating that at some point during the investigation, the RCMP's tactics and strategy for trying to find these guys changed significantly. And she said that, and she was trying to get an exception to the sort of solicitor-client privilege between the Crown and the RCMP in order to expose this document and say, look, Johnston and whatever his name is, sorry, were too heavily involved in this, and my client's innocence is at stake, and this is probably prosecutorial misconduct. And I believe it was called a crime fraud exception she was applying for. And then there was a closed door meeting at court. Those documents that Rolston alleges to have been seen have been sealed. They're gone, right? And they were kept out of the court trial. So I don't know if there's a mechanism to get those documents unsealed at some point in the future. But between that, the ATIP documents, and it was shown in the proceedings that an RCMP Superintendent Gordon Corbett said that he was communicating at a platinum level, right, with RCMP command in Ottawa, including the Deputy Commissioner Zablocki, who's basically was Brenda Lucky's right-hand man, right? So you have to wonder, with all of this smoke, is there fire? Was the Prime Minister's office or his incident response group on a fishing expedition? In part because, Marco Mendocino is running around with his hair on fire about Diagolon and this extremist group that's armed to the teeth and they're going to overthrow the government, right? Like it sounds, if you start looking at this, the possibility that there was a fishing expedition that was ordered from Ottawa to try and find the evidence they needed to prove all of the rhetoric they had been saying to the public about this super dangerous threat, right? Like, they didn't have actual evidence of it. They only had allegations from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network about a podcaster and his fans. They didn't have anything. So it seems to me like there's a possibility that directions came down to find something and manufacture something to backfill their claims and therefore justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Well, you anticipated my next question, Gord, because I was going to say, is it fair to say that the Prime Minister's office conspired with the RCMP because they were looking for a pretext to invoke the Emergencies Act, and of course they supposedly found one here. And what I find interesting, though, in terms of what you're saying about a trumped up case, if you follow the trial of Chris Barber and Tamara Leach in Ottawa here, and I've been to just about every day of that trial, the prosecution has presented absolutely no evidence of any violence, of any intent for violence. Every video and every recording they played has either Tamara or Chris saying, "Remember, folks, please behave yourselves. Do not do anything violent. Do not upset the locals. Listen to the police. We're not here for violent protests. We are peacefully protesting." So what is the Crown trying to establish here? Well, you wanted that. You were thinking about it. You were thinking about violent protests, and that's how we're going to get you. And I can see that coming because I see a tie-in here now, and I think I just realized this while talking to you this morning. This is where they're going to go with the trial of Chris and Tamara because they've got no evidence on them at all. Nothing. And this is, they were looking for a pretext in Coots, and they found it. But ironically, and nobody ever seems to ask this question, the border situation was already resolved by February 14th. There was no cause. There was no pretext to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Right,
There
and
was no violent protest.
it's
Go
even
ahead.
worse. It's even worse out in Coots because they claimed that the guys at Coots had completely blocked the border off. And I think that may have been true for the first couple of days, January 29th and 30th. But at some point, there was one lane of traffic going in either direction. So there was a slowdown. But there was also two other border crossings not too far away that trucks could have used, and many of them did. The actual total highway shutdown that occurred near Coots was up in Milk River, the next town north along Highway 4, where the RCMP had the road completely blocked off going south. And then the RCMP had checkpoints at the intersections with all the side roads in the area. So this notion that the Freedom Convoy guys in Coots were responsible for the highway being closed is nonsense. There was a slowdown, but the actual shutdown came from the RCMP themselves.
What about, if you can comment on it, what about this cache of weapons that was discovered? And do you think you think there's something funny about all that?
No, well, I mean, there's something funny about the way they framed it. Everybody will remember that famous propaganda photo that went out that very night. Was it the 13th or the 14th that went out on the wire, and people continue to reference it, this table full of guns and ammo and all that stuff. People need to remember that, there was 13 people arrested, and 9 of them were not kept in jail for 2 years. And who knows who they could have belonged to, right? So a number of those weapons, I believe 3 or 4 of the weapons in that photo, have never been traced to an owner, and a bunch of them they were seized from multiple different locations and then put all in one spot. And they don't ever tell you that, like, Chris Carber, yeah, he had 2 rifles, but they were stored in his travel trailer, properly secured on private property, not at the protest site, like, half a kilometer away or something like that. And you have to prove intent. And in the verdict of Chris Carber and Tony Olenek, they could not put the conspiracy to murder together. And throughout the trial, they were never able to establish any intent. And there's it's Alberta. Everybody has guns. There's bounties for coyotes and gophers because gophers dig holes which harm livestock, And, Tony, I think one of the other things here we have to think about the guns, which is should be very concerning to Canadians, is that the dangerous purpose, the dangerous purpose and how they were able to quote unquote prove that is that Tony admitted that, they're for self-defense because you never know if they're going to send Antifa or maybe there'll be Chinese Communist Party people here, right? Like, that you do not have a right to self-defense in Canada, and most cops will tell you that, right? You're not allowed to have guns for self-defense. End of story. So that was the dangerous purpose. They were never able to prove that this had anything to do with the plan for killing police or anything like that. And a bunch of those guns didn't even belong to those guys. It was sort of a chimera, right? Like, it was used as a propaganda device to scare the hell out of people because Canada, for better or worse, is now an urban country, and most people live in cities. They have no idea what rural life is like, and they don't have any idea about guns whatsoever. So it was a perfect propaganda tool.
Well, yeah, it certainly was. And I think from beginning to end, people smelled something about this whole investigation because we know that former RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki was working for Justin Trudeau's policy in many ways, especially in terms of gun control. So, and this was, of course, another red flag for the opponents of anybody owning a firearm of any kind. That these people are going to put them in the trunk and plan insurrection. So this was another victory for the opponents of firearms possession ownership in this country.
Right.
And I
No,
think
another interesting thing about the gun stuff is that, like, okay, let's even say they were guilty of, weapons possession, right? Like, if you look at what the normal fines or punishments are for that, they don't involve being thrown in jail for 2.5 years, right? Like Chris Lysak, who pled out on February 6th, he was guilty technically of a gun mishandling charge. That would have normally seen him get a fine, or maybe they might have seized his pistol. That doesn't mean you spend 2 years of your life locked away in jail with no bail, right?
Absolutely not. And it it strikes me though that I think what you've said today is another bombshell. This is all about thought crimes, and I can see where this is going with Tamara and Chris. And thank you so much for your interest and concern on the Online Harms Act, because you wouldn't believe the indifference that I'm seeing from so many Canadians about this bill. And in fact, the official opposition Conservatives, they only got interested in this when it was revealed that it was going to cost like $250 million to set up the censorship group that's going to oversee this whole thing. It's another layer of bureaucracy. And oh, it's going to cost 250 million. That's terrible. But prior to that, there wasn't a single question in the House of Commons from the Conservatives, and certainly you'll get nothing from the NDP. They love this, but nothing from the Conservatives about how this is going to not just impact free speech, is going to destroy free speech, annihilate it. And I am asking for Canadians to say, if you want the ability to still be free in this country in 84, we've got to fight this bill. I think we might have a chance of this bill not passing before the next election, if we have a next election. And I leave that out there because we might have another emergency, another crisis, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's another incident with a proposed insurrection. I don't put anything past this Liberal government in terms of avoiding the next election. I'm very concerned that they will pass this Online Harms Act rapidly in the next session of Parliament. And I think I hope and pray, if we do have another government post Trudeau, that government has the guts and the intelligence to repeal Bill C-63. So I'm not entirely optimistic. I don't trust politicians anymore. I worked in the House of Commons for 8 years. The legacy of that for me was to never trust politicians, because they will never tell you anything except what you want to hear. And I'm biding my time, but I'm fighting. And I think that's probably where you are too. We have to, if we, there's a great line from that classic film Casablanca, that if we stop breathing, we will die. If we stop fighting, the world will die. And it's the resistance fighter says that in the movie, the Paul Heinrich character. And that has been an inspiration for me over the last couple of years, ever since I was there for the Freedom Convoy, and I said, if we don't fight, this country is going to die in front of us. And I'll leave the last words to you.
Right. Well, as you said, Canadians are a little bit lax in paying attention to what's going on with the government. The Conservatives only seem to care about the money with the Online Harms Act. They also came to the party late with defending the Freedom Convoy or doing anything to stop the mandates. We have a pretty major problem in Canada under this terrible ruling class and an opposition that doesn't actually oppose anything. Canadians need to wake up and start taking what they used to have seriously, so we don't lose it for good.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And just wanted to show your Substack there. Please have a look at Gord's Substack. It's phenomenal. He's doing original research, original journalism, unlike a lot of people who are just showing clips and nothing else. So it's fantastic. And I want to thank you for joining me today, Gord, and I hope we can do this again. I know you've been on shows like Tucker Carlson. You've been sharing this story with a huge audience. Mine is a little less than Tucker's, but I wanted to add too, though, I didn't realize this until the other day, that this Disinformation Governance Board was, of course, dissolved because of the huge cry over how ludicrous this was and how dangerous this was. But the FBI quietly took up the duties, if you will, of doing this. And I heard this the other day when I was watching Redacted with Clayton Morris, and I'm a weekly regular on his show. But he was talking about how the FBI is now doing this. The Biden administration quietly shifted this responsibility to the FBI from the Department of Homeland Security. So now it's part of the Justice Department. So, I mean, These governments will do anything to pull the wool over our eyes. They will do anything to put us under surveillance, to censor what we say. And it's only because people like you, Gord, are fighting back that I think we have any hope of winning this. So thank you so much for joining me today, and let's do it again. And God bless you and the work you're doing, and all prosperity to not only this work, but in your personal work as a independent trucker. So thank you so much, Gord, and we will leave it there.
All right, thanks so much for having me, David. Keep on paying attention and fighting back.
We will do. Thank you for watching Stand on Guard today. My guest has been Gord Magill, and please support the station any way you can, but more so support the fight for free speech in this country.